And so Shahid and Emma, I will leave you to this wonderful discussion.
Emma, as you've covered student debt, what jumps out at you as the issue that maybe the mainstream public, or let's say Wall Street, has yet to internalize and grapple with?
So the thing that sticks out to me more than anything is when Medicare for All was being discussed at length in the Democratic primary, it was always about the cost. So, for example, every question was teed up to Bernie Sanders of how unrealistic is this proposal? Look at the cost, look at the price tag. And, other candidates were allowed to extrapolate on their ideas, but it was always framed in a negative way in terms of the cost of Bernie Sanders' programs. But I digress. College for all, college guaranteed for all, is actually quite cheap. There are different ideas, but one of the ranges of costs is $70 billion a year. That was the Sanders proposal. And that's nothing for the federal government, truly. But what's not talked enough about is that the federal government gives out loans. They make interest on those loans. And I think they are the #1 student loan provider or servicer in the entire country. And interest rates vary by year. Last year, I believe it was around 4.5%, but they make money off of students having to go into debt to go to college. And I think it's unconscionable, but it's one of those realities that the American public has agreed to without fully diagnosing and understanding how immoral it is.
I've seen Betsy DeVos propose privatizing that burden, sort of making it even worse. Can you talk a little bit about how much worse that would be than how much worse the crisis could get if we followed that right-wing lead?
Well, yeah, I mean, we already see how unethical the servicers for these loans are if you're not getting them from the federal government. I mean, pick your poison, but the worst evil is to get a student loan from a private entity where basically you could go into forbearance. There have been many reports that they encourage students to go into forbearance because the interest still accumulates when you're paying off those loans. And they like that because then down the road, they're going to have to pay off a little bit more. But it's just a quick fix for someone who's in dire need of holding on to a bit of cash. And so it's immensely predatory. And when you talk about Betsy DeVos, she undid the measly things that President Obama's administration did during his time to kind of cut back on that predatory nature. She, in fact, took unilateral action basically at the Department of Education to hide information that she was getting from those student loan servicers when it came to providing that information to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which the Trump administration has decided to completely hollow out. But that's just one of the examples of how corporate this administration is, obviously, but how when you don't make substantive changes like the ones being encouraged and talked about by Bernie Sanders, other big thinkers like Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar, et cetera, it's very easy to dismantle them. Part of why the healthcare system in Great Britain is so strong and difficult to get rid of is because it is substantive and because it is all-encompassing, even though they've had a strong conservative and neoliberal movement there, like we've seen in the United States.
One of the things I've been surprised to discover is just how many students struggle to get into the principal balances of paying down their loans. Like how many people get stuck for a long time just paying down interest, to your point about how, lower payments stretch out the debt burden and ultimately can increase the aggregate amount that somebody is paying back over time. Can you talk a little bit about that, how the erosion in the job market has complicated the repayment picture for people and what that has led to in the aggregate?
Certainly. I mean, especially in what we're seeing with what you talked about in your interview, the gig economy, it's much more difficult for people who they aren't provided healthcare benefits through their job, other expenses that aren't provided, but they are able to get quick cash by doing things for DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, et cetera. That makes the burden even greater. And then we're talking about this current economic landscape, which is even more dire than I think any politician or any pundit on television is talking about. I saw on Financial News Network saying that oh, we're going to be back to the unemployment rate at the start of 2021. 10% unemployment rate at the start of next year is the best case scenario.
Yeah.
So just imagining it, say you wanted to get your master's degree, say you wanted to become a doctor, say you wanted to, work in a field that required more schooling. And now you're looking at this market where there's a shortage, although the doctor thing wouldn't necessarily apply there. That burden is going to be even greater, almost insurmountable. And we touch on the mental health aspect of it too. Conservatives talk all the time about the American family, buy a home, white picket fence, whatever. It's impossible when you have this albatross around your neck and you're not able to get married. You can't afford an engagement ring, as was discussed in that interview as well. You can't afford a wedding. You can't afford to have kids. You certainly can't afford a mortgage. So they've made it impossible for an entire generation, except for the top children of the top 10%, basically, to live up to the expectations that they set. And then they spit in millennials' faces and call them lazy and say it's because we buy too much avocado toast.
Well, and that derision, I'm thinking about a particular presidential nominee declaring publicly that he had no empathy, for instance, for that generation. The derision of the burden that people are facing, I think, has led to some of this inaction in Congress. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the proposals that have been offered? You mentioned Bernie Sanders and the College for All proposal. I'm thinking about Ilhan Omer's to, offset $30,000 each for borrowers. Are there any other particular policy proposals responding to the debt crisis that the corporate Congress has seen fit to sit on and not move forward that come to your mind?
Honestly, those are the major ones that I would have talked about that you hit on there. I think that there is an interesting phenomenon there. I was actually talking about this last night with my family in our very fascinating quarantine discussions where we're all cooped up together, was about just how it's really hard to get advocacy that's more specifically tailored for millennials or young people through Congress because they're older. And I'm not ageist. Your opponent, Nancy Pelosi, is 80 years old. And I do think that affects her worldview, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Obviously, I supported Bernie Sanders in the primary, but it just makes you that much disconnected from the realities of a generation that is completely burdened by the crime, just the crime of wanting to get an education or being told you needed to, or you were not going to be competitive. Take an unpaid internship, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars at this college, get an extra degree. And then, by the way, you won't be able to get a job to pay that off. The debt is going to accumulate and these banks and servicers are going to get rich. It's hard to get that through someone's head who's older and, going to college was what, $400 a semester back then? And specifically, as you talked about earlier, someone who is that egregiously wealthy doesn't need to always be the case. I understand that. Well, some wealthy people can be great advocates for other policies, but it's in conjunction with everything she stands for in Congress that makes it a pretty clear picture in my view.
Yeah, the 33 years that Pelosi has represented San Francisco have seen any number of changes in the surrounding economy, culture, and she still remains very much sort of trapped in Reagan's America and has a limited vision of political possibility by virtue of that generational.
Can I just quickly, because that's such a great point, just touch on that. I think that there are Democrats from that generation that have a sort of PTSD when it comes to thinking big. They're terrified of being called a commie or whatever. I mean, democratic socialism, it's I know you identify as one, Shahid, and it's sweeping the nation, and it's not a dirty word anymore, but they cannot get out of that framework. And part of the reason they refuse to get out of that framework is because their donors want that to remain the case. And so it's kind of this cyclical thing where, you don't believe there are any possibilities to make people's lives better that are substantive, and you're incentivized to think that way at the same time.
Yeah, entirely too many people forget that democratic socialism is proudly and firmly rooted in American history. I think about President Roosevelt and this proposed second Bill of Rights. He envisioned a universal right to healthcare and a right to shelter and a right to food. Those human rights are profoundly revolutionary in the context of the system we live in today. Do you want to say anything about that in terms of the long-term changes in the Democratic Party, in terms of the values of the party that were long established being abandoned in the service of those corporate donors that have come to grip the party and drive its direction in the years since?
Well, certainly. I mean, it blows my mind that, as you talked about earlier, the people who are the spokespeople, I didn't want to say people again, the spokespeople for the Democratic Party are wealthier, upper class, and almost give off the appearance as, and I think sometimes do, that they are the elitists when it comes to Washington, D.C., when the values that the Democratic Party and liberals are supposed to espouse are meant to create equity and equality, which are very founding principles of this country. But they have decided to give that mantle over in terms of perception to Republicans, so Trump can play faux populist and pretend to care about workers, and then Nancy Pelosi stands in front of her fridge with her, $20 ice cream, or Joe Biden remains and seems entirely disconnected from regular people. Hillary Clinton obviously epitomized that disconnect from regular folks and just epitomized elitism, and that's why she lost, in my view. So they've really moved away from that, and it's really hard to walk that tightrope to say that you are the more pro-worker party when your leaders exhibit the exact opposite. Maybe not exactly in the technical substance of the legislation that they're putting forth, but in their actions and aura. And I think that's part of the reason that the Democratic Party is pathetic in terms of wins when it comes to Congress, governors, etc. And presidential races, by the way. The last major, winning presidential candidate ran to the left in the Democratic primary. We forget that was Barack Obama. Didn't legislate that way, but that's a whole nother thing.
Well, if you're absolutely right, and all three of the last presidents have come from outsiders. Bush was an outsider, Obama was an outsider, Trump was an outsider. Outsider candidates are who the American public wants, because Washington is rightfully held in such disrepute for precisely the reasons that we're describing. And it is striking to see the corporate Democratic Party duck into the punch of supporting insiders as opposed to the outside voices who resonate more strongly with Americans struggling with our various challenges in the face of this predatory system. Gina, did you want to get
outsiders like yourself, Shahid? Go.
Yeah, I do actually have a question for the both of you. As we thank you, Emma, for your insight on all of this. We want to kind of head into some Q&A here from questions that have come in from our viewers. But one question I do have is for the both of you: why do you think that Pelosi left the debt relief out of the bill?
I think, well, do you want to go first? I mean, just her donors is pretty clear, right. But you can go on.
Well, yeah, it was the tighter way I'd put it is just her class interests, and I'd link it to, there were other things that she left out of the bill. I think about the Paycheck Guarantee Act that Pramila Jayapal had proposed, and what's interesting about that is the support for that measure has included not only progressive Democrats but centrists too, the very same centrists that Pelosi claims she is defending by promoting conservative positions within the Democratic Party, have outflanked her on the left. The Intercept has reported it as presenting a crisis in her leadership because she relies on conservative votes that are abandoning her because Pelosi is more conservative than even conservative Democrats while representing San Francisco. And, when you ask why, I think she has a perception of the party's interests that's rooted in this construction of a Reagan America that is simply no longer the case. And we all are paying too great a price for that confusion.
And just to add a tiny bit onto that HEROES Act, she could have done whatever she wanted. It was considered a wish list by Republicans. They said they were going to throw it out no matter what. So might as well put what you actually want in it. And people are saying, well, why didn't she go harder? What I think a lot of folks are missing is that those lobbyist bailouts, those dark money bailouts, those state and local tax deductions that help the rich, that is what she wanted.
Right. Yeah, got that. No, thank you. Thank you for that, both. So Emma, we got a question here for you from Alex M from LA. If there was free college, would we have fewer quality student athletes?
Oh, I don't think so. The best student athletes in terms of, I follow college football and a little bit of college basketball. College athletes should be getting paid proportional to the ticket sales and how much revenue that they generate for colleges. It's absolutely criminal that schools like Alabama or I don't know, Texas, A&M, Florida, whatever have you, make hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars off of these students' labors. They can tear their ACL, be done, never make it in the NFL, never get a payday. So they're already not paid, but they're already on a free ride with a scholarship to these high quality, athletic schools. But I think we should go further, and they should be paid for their labor, and not have these rich white guys making money off of all of them, and they never see the return potentially.
Got it. Thanks, Emma. Shahid, we have a question here from Michael B. from Facebook. If you get elected, will you continue to challenge neoliberal corporatists, or will you get along to get along?
It's a great question. I am intrigued that Facebook is the place from which our questioner writes, as opposed to a place, but just an interesting reflection of the times in which we live. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a careerist. People go along to get along because they put their careers before their responsibilities. If I put my career before my responsibilities, I'd still be at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. That was a great career. I really enjoyed working there. The issues were compelling. I loved my colleagues. It was secure. There's not a lot of job security in running for office against the most powerful corporate politician on the planet, right? And I'm not here for my career. There are a lot more important things in this world than our careers, and I'm here to defend the future. And if that requires going to war with the party establishment, I'm doing it now. I don't have any intention of stopping until we recover that establishment, recommit the Democratic Party to its roots in serving the needs of working people. That's the point at which I'll stop going to war with the party establishment, when it starts fighting for we the people of the United States.
Got it. Thanks, Shahid. I know, Emma, we're going to lose you here in a second. Can I just give one more question for you?
Absolutely.
I don't know who this question came from, but here's a question. As an indie journalist, what do you think of indie media today, and what can we do better?
Oh, man, look, I think indie media is really trying their hardest. I think one of the things that's really tough, one, we don't get paid anything, just so you know. Two, Gina
can
knows.
vouch for that. I can vouch.
Gina knows. Two, a lot of the revenue we make is on YouTube and Facebook, and they are basically judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to monetization. So you have to fit their idea of what is marketable and fits for their advertisers. It is a daily struggle to deal with one of those companies just saying, I don't like this content, even if it's not offensive, showing violence, whatever, and they'll just take away the money. And God knows we need it. So it's to be dealing as a smaller company, I think, with large corporations that are beholden to no one, acting as some sort of filtration to revenue. It is a really, really difficult daily struggle for me. And I know it is for a lot of my colleagues as well. That's just talking about video content. Obviously, when you talk about people who are writing, it's really hard. So many people are freelancers. A lot of these indie media sites don't have the revenue to pay them, but also they should be paying them. I understand that. It's just, advertisers have completely milked these smaller companies and aren't really, I think, paying out in the way that they need to be, and that's proportional to what they're getting out of them. So,
Emma, we want to thank you so much, and thanks for answering that question. I can vouch for it. So with that, we thank you so much for the work that you do and the reporting that you do, traveling around the country, meeting some of the craziest people too, by the way, putting yourself out there to, give us good news. So we really appreciate you. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today on this live stream with Shahid and myself.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. You're the best. I'll talk to you soon. And Shahid, Thank you for having me. It was great chatting with you. I'm sure we'll talk soon.
I look forward to it. Thanks again, Emma.
Have a great night.
Yeah, you too. Bye.